Good afternoon, everybody. This is Pastor Ty. This is our sermon recap from yesterday's message. We are in the middle of a year-long series through the Gospel of Mark called King and Kingdom. And we were covering Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 44 yesterday. And the title of yesterday's sermon was New Manna. And so Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 44 documents the miraculous feeding of the 5,000 by Jesus out in a desolate place. And we're just going to review very quickly some of the main highlights of yesterday's sermon, which is available on the website at kindredchurch.com/sermons. And the big things that I want to take away from this are we noticed very early on in this text that the disciples are on the way of Jesus now. And one of the ways that that's so abundantly clear is because everything that Jesus had experienced previously in the Gospel of Mark is now being experienced by the disciples. So, for instance, Jesus at the end of Mark chapter 1, after his popularity starts to rise, goes out into a desolate place. When the disciples get back from their first successful commission, Jesus goes with them into a desolate place. There are moments early in Jesus's ministry in Mark's Gospel where he's so popular that he doesn't even have a moment's peace to eat, right? There will be times where he's in a house and the crowds will be so great that he can't even eat. We were told in verse 31 that the disciples, when they come back, are led by Jesus out to a remote and desolate place because so many were coming and going that they had no leisure and they couldn't even eat, right? So what we're seeing these parallels start to come up. We also notice the people flocking to wherever they're at, and Jesus has compassion on them, just like he had compassion on the leper back at the end of Mark chapter 1. So the parallel is very thick. We're seeing almost a recalibration of earlier parts of Mark's gospel, only this time the disciples are included, so that the stakes just keep getting higher. The other thing we noticed is this feeling of compassion that Jesus has is very clearly by Mark positioning him as the greater Joshua, because if you go back to the Old Testament and you examine the important text of Numbers chapter 27, you find that when Moses was appointing Joshua, son of Nun, to follow in his footsteps, he says the following: "Let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation, who shall go out before them and come in before them, who shall lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be as sheep that have no shepherd." And so Joshua, son of Nun, was seen as this leader who would allow Israel not to be shepherdless. And so when Jesus sees the crowd, has compassion on them, and sees them as sheep without a shepherd, the text is identifying him as the greater Joshua. And the reason why this is so profound is because Jesus' actual name would have been Yeshua or Joshua. And so Yahweh is salvation. And so this quite literally is the greater Joshua occurring in the biblical text. The other thing that we made very, very clearly pointed out in yesterday's sermon was that it's not an accident that Jesus feeds the 5,000 right after last week's sermon on John the Baptist's passion narrative, where Herod Antipas throws a banquet. And while at the banquet, it is brought up that he is going to give John the Baptist's head on a platter to his stepdaughter at the urging of Herod Antipas's wife, Herodias. And so it's interesting that this is such a different feast from what Herod Antipas threw earlier in the Markan text. And so Herod Antipas throws a feast, but no food is mentioned. In fact, the only thing that's put on a platter that we hear of in that passage is John the Baptist's head. So it's a feast of death. Whereas right after this, Jesus is not in a palatial setting. He's not surrounded by the great men of Galilee. He's in a desolate place. He's with commoners who have no food and no lodging. And it's here that Jesus miraculously feeds. And so in the place you wouldn't expect, there is this feast of abundance. And that's really where we drove this sermon as we started to land the plane yesterday, was this idea that there is abundance in the wilderness occurring in Jesus's ministry. And this should be major alarm bells back to Exodus 16, the idea of the Lord providing abundance in the wilderness. Manna, right? Bread from heaven, daily bread. This idea of great provision. but that it comes as a sort of test. Because if you recall, if the 4-word phrase that describes how God treated Israel during their sojourning was abundance in the wilderness, another 4 words on top of that would be, but the people grumbled. So where there's abundance, there's grumbling. Unfortunately, that's sort of what we see in the Old Testament text. And so the question is, will this new Israel in a new wilderness being provided a new type of bread, will they have a better result to this test of abundance in the wilderness? Will they believe and have confidence in the Lord's provision? And ultimately what we land the plane on, and why the sermon was titled New Manna, is because this has never really been about bread. It's what the bread points to. And so the best way to sum this up is bread is faith, right? And if faith is what we're actually talking about, then that means faith is the new manna. That's the new bread from heaven. And Jesus helps us make this connection, because in John chapter 6, verses 47 through 51, Jesus says something so fascinating, and I think it directly connects to the miraculous feeding we encounter here in Mark 6. In John 6, 47 through 51, Jesus said the following: "Truly I say to you, whoever believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh." And so what we're finding in the text today is that Jesus, in this moment, in a desolate place, providing abundance in the wilderness, is creating a new wilderness experience, right? A new test of faith. And so if Yahweh provides manna in the wilderness for Israel, Jesus is providing an opportunity for faith to a new Israel in the promised land. And so the question is going to be, who will enter the ultimate promised land by faith? Because through Christ and through his provision and through his saving work, we can belong to this new Israel. We can belong to the kingdom of heaven in a new promised land. And the way through that is by faith. And so that is the big question that comes out of this, is will we eat the new manna? And this is why the Lord's Supper, this is why communion is so critical to the Christian experience. We ought to be, as often as we can remember, as Paul writes, remembering that we get to take and consume the new manna, that by faith we can enjoy eternal life in the person of Jesus Christ. And so be of great encouragement this week. My prayer is that you will take this with you through the next several days before we can meet again next Sunday and examine the last several verses of Mark chapter 6. God be with you.